A German shepherd emerged from the mist rolling in from the Atlantic coast, his gait uneven, a limp evident with each step. His fur clung to his ribs, soaked through from the night's drizzle, and hunger had stripped him down to a skeletal shadow of himself. Between his jaws he clenched an old canvas sack, torn at the edges, scraping the road with every dragging step. Horns blared faintly in the distance, but the dog kept moving until he reached the main gate of the Marine Corps base. Then, in an act no one could have predicted, he straightened his weary frame, pressed his front paws together against the wet ground, as though offering a prayer. From within the sack came a faint whimper, a fragile cry holding on to life by a thread. One Marine stood at the post, and in that moment, one decision would change everything. Before we dive into the story, where are you watching from? Let us know your country in the comments. And if you believe no man or animal should be abandoned, subscribe now. Because what follows may just remind you that miracles still exist. Savannah, Georgia, was rarely still, even in the earliest hours. Yet that winter morning felt suspended, wrapped in a heavy silence as though the entire city had drawn a foggy blanket over itself and drifted back into sleep. The marshes along the shore exhaled mist that curled through the tall pines, rolling across chain-link fences that circled the Marine Corps compound. Lamps at the gate glimmered faintly, halos of yellow fighting against the pale shroud. Rainwater still lingered on the asphalt, reflecting those weak lights in patches. Sergeant Daniel Cole stood at his post beside the guardhouse, collar pulled up against the bite of the cold. 35 years of age, built solid from years of deployments and training fields, he looked like a man carved for endurance. His height made him stand out, his squared jaw gave him authority, yet what softened his presence was the quiet warmth in his hazel eyes. There was no dramatic scar on his face, nothing to announce him as a soldier, but the weathering of sun and rain was written across his skin, reminders of deserts and coasts he had served under. Among his fellow Marines, Daniel's reputation was simple, dependable. The kind of man who carried more than his share, who listened more than he spoke, who re-enlisted not because he lacked choices, but because he believed someone had to stand between the vulnerable and the storm. This morning promised nothing more than routine. Check IDs. Wave through a few trucks. Maybe nod at a jogger running along the fence line. He shifted his weight in his boots, blew into a styrofoam cup of coffee that had already turned lukewarm, and let the steam fog his vision. The hum of the highway was barely audible beyond the marshland, dulled by the thick air. For a fleeting moment, Daniel thought of his younger sister, just a few miles away, who teased him endlessly about picking shifts that stole his sleep. He didn't mind mornings like this, though. Guard duty had its own kind of solitude, sometimes it was a gift. That quiet was broken when a shadow appeared on the road. At first glance, it seemed no more than a stray nosing through the mist. That was hardly unusual near the city's edge, where unwanted dogs wandered alleys and back roads. But as the shape drew closer, Daniel lowered his cup, narrowing his eyes. His grip unconsciously tightened on the strap of his rifle. It wasn't just a stray. The form resolved into a German shepherd, gaunt to the bone. Rain had plastered its sable coat flat, tangles matted across its flanks. Each step was labored, paws dragging as if the dog carried more than it could bear. And it did. In its teeth hung a canvas sack, heavy, soaked, frayed at the seams. The sack scraped along the wet pavement, leaving behind a dark trail. Daniel frowned, alert now. Dogs often carried scraps or sticks, but this was something else. The shepherd staggered to the gate's threshold and stopped, chest heaving, ribs caving and expanding like bellows starved of air. With careful precision, it lowered the sack onto the ground. Then the dog did something that rooted Daniel where he stood. The shepherd raised its weary body as high as it could, lifted its head toward him, and pressed its front paws together. Not scratching. Not pawing. Pressing, like folded hands in prayer. Daniel blinked hard, half convinced his fatigue had distorted the moment. But the gesture was too deliberate to dismiss. His training told him not to ascribe human meaning to animal actions, yet his instincts, the instincts sharpened in battlefields far away, whispered that this was not chance. This was intent. The shepherd whined low, its ears twitching, yet it held its ground. Desperation shone in those eyes, raw but intelligent. Daniel crouched, gaze fixed on the sack. It was stained darker than rainwater. With cautious fingers, he tugged the frayed knot loose. The fabric peeled back, and from within came a sound, faint, weak, a whimper closer to breath than voice. Daniel's jaw tightened. Inside lay a tiny puppy, more bone than flesh. Its ribs jutted sharply, bald patches exposing raw skin. Its small chest fluttered once, twice, faltering like a candle in the wind. Daniel pressed 2 fingers to its side. A heartbeat answered, faint, fragile, almost imagined. The shepherd nudged the sack with its nose, whining again, then lifted its eyes to Daniel's. No aggression lived in that look, only a plea, as if the dog were speaking in silence, "Help him, please." Daniel swallowed hard. He was no veterinarian, no medic for animals, but he knew this sight, the thin veil between life and death. He had carried Marines bleeding out in desert dust, had held men as they whispered their last words. And here, at a quiet base in fog-draped savannah, a stray had placed another fragile life in his care. Regulations echoed faintly in his mind, the unspoken rules against strays, against exceptions. But the creed of the uniform weighed heavier. No one left behind. He slid his arms beneath the sack and lifted the trembling pup as if it were made of glass. Against his chest, Daniel felt the faint heat of its body, fragile but present. The shepherd's tail flicked once, the barest spark of hope. Daniel turned toward the guardhouse. Fog swirled as he moved, the German shepherd trailing behind with unsteady steps, as if bound by a vow not to lose sight of the Marine carrying its charge. The guardhouse smelled faintly of stale coffee and damp wool, the heater working in vain against the chill that seeped through its seams. Sergeant Daniel Cole stepped inside with the trembling bundle pressed close to his chest. The German shepherd followed, its wet paws leaving dark tracks on the floor, ribs showing with every shallow breath. Behind the desk sat Lance Corporal Henry Miles, 22, broad-shouldered, with the nervous energy of someone new to service. His round face still carried a trace of boyhood, freckles scattered across his nose. Henry had earned a reputation for joking at the wrong times, but the sight before him, his seasoned sergeant holding a frail pup, and a half-starved shepherd hovering like a shadow, silenced even his tongue. His mouth opened, then snapped shut when Daniel's expression warned this was no moment for levity. Daniel laid the tiny pup carefully on a folded blanket atop the desk. The creature shivered under the damp fabric, its breath so faint that Henry instinctively leaned closer, eyes wide. The shepherd stood rigidly nearby, dripping water onto the tiles, its gaze pinned to the desk with a kind of desperate devotion. Each shallow rise of the pup's chest seemed to tether the larger dog in place, as if sheer will could keep the fragile spark alive. Daniel's voice broke the silence, low, almost reverent. "You're not just a stray, are you? You knew what you were carrying." The shepherd sank back on its haunches, panting shallowly. Then, once more, it pressed its paws together, that strange, unmistakable gesture. Henry exhaled sharply, whispering under his breath, "What in the world?" Before Daniel could answer, footsteps echoed down the corridor. The door opened, and in stepped First Lieutenant Mark Grayson. Grayson was a man built of regulation itself. In his mid-40s, his salt and pepper hair was cut with crisp precision, his boots polished enough to catch reflections, his expression calm but sharp. He had a reputation across the base, fair, but cautious. A man who followed rules not because he lacked compassion, but because he had seen what happened when order slipped too often. His eyes landed on Daniel first, then shifted to the sodden shepherd and the bundle on the desk. His brows rose in clipped surprise. "What in God's name is this, Sergeant?" Daniel adjusted his grip, peeling back the canvas just enough to reveal the frail pup, its sides fluttering shallowly. "Found them at the gate, sir. Without care, this one won't survive the hour." Grayson's jaw tightened. He glanced at the shepherd, which lowered its head, tail stiff, and gave a low whine. His hand twitched toward the radio clip to his belt. "Cole," Grayson said flatly, "we are not a shelter. You know that. Strays are turned over to civilian facilities. This is not Marine business." Daniel squared his shoulders. His voice was steady, though his chest still burned from the run. "With respect, sir. This life was left at our doorstep. If we turn away, it dies here. That's not who we are." For a beat, the room fell into silence. The shepherd's body quivered, ears pressed back, yet its eyes never left the lieutenant's face. It was as though the animal itself understood the weight of the moment, begging without words. Grayson pinched the bridge of his nose, his expression carved with frustration. "You're putting me in a corner, Sergeant." Before Daniel could respond, a third voice carried from the hallway. Corporal James Walker strolled in, his presence immediately lighter, almost reckless. James was 30, lean, sandy-haired, with eyes that danced like he was always half a step from a joke. Among his peers, he was the Joker, the one who could make men laugh in the darkest of times. But those who knew him better understood his humor was armor, a shield built after losing two close friends overseas. He stopped short when he saw the shepherd, the pup, and Daniel's grim face. For once, his grin softened into something genuine. "Well, Cole," he said, tilting his head, "seems God decided to test you before breakfast. Maybe sent that mutt to see if you still had a heartbeat." Daniel shot him a look that was half reproach, half gratitude for breaking the tension. Grayson sighed again, his gaze flicking between the frail pup and the sergeant who stood so firmly. "If command hears of this, I'll be the one writing the reports. You know that." Daniel's voice did not waver. "Then let me write them, sir. I'll take the consequences. But I won't stand by." The words hung heavy, final. The lieutenant studied Daniel for a long moment, the weight of years in his narrowed eyes. Then, slowly, his shoulders dropped, a faint crack in his armor of discipline. "Fine," he said at last. "But do it quietly. Take it to the infirmary. And Sergeant, do it fast." Relief surged through Daniel's chest. He nodded sharply. "Understood, sir." The shepherd seemed to understand too. Its tail gave a weak twitch, the faintest hint of gratitude. James stepped closer, smirking. "Guess I'm coming with you. Someone's gotta keep you from fainting when the needles come out." Daniel ignored the jab, though he was glad for his friend's company. Together, they moved down the hall, Daniel with the frail pup in his arms, James by his side, and the shepherd trailing close behind. Each step echoed in the foggy silence, a strange procession of soldier, stray, and fragile life. The compound outside was beginning to stir, boots clattering, voices carrying through the mist. A few Marines glanced curiously at the sight, their stoic sergeant with a bundle in his arms, flanked by a starved shepherd that followed like a battered angel on duty. The infirmary came into view, a squat brick building glowing faintly against the dawn. Inside, antiseptic mixed with the softer undertones of cloth and paper. Behind the desk stood Private First Class Maria Torres, petite and barely 20, her dark hair pulled tight into a bun. She was known for her quiet, steady work and the gentle habit of humming while she cleaned. Her wide brown eyes flicked from Daniel to the bundle in his arms. "What, Sergeant? What's going on?" she stammered. "No time," Daniel answered quickly. "Where's Dr. Carter?" "Back, prepping supplies." Torres hesitated only a second before rushing to pull open the curtain. Dr. Emily Carter emerged, gloves already half on, her chestnut hair falling loose from her bun. At 28, she was young, but her sharp eyes missed nothing. A medic's daughter, raised in a family where service meant sacrifice, she had chosen the Corps not for glory, but to stand where others often turned away. She froze at the sight, Daniel with the soaked bundle, James hovering behind him, and the skeletal shepherd pressed close. "What on earth," she began, then stopped when she caught the look in Daniel's eyes. Her own expression hardened into resolve. Put it on the table. Now. Daniel obeyed, laying the fragile pup onto the steel surface. The little body barely stirred, its breath feather-light against the cold air. Emily snapped on her gloves fully, already reaching for gauze and stethoscope. Torres hurried to her side, her humming replaced by urgent silence. The shepherd sat at the threshold, trembling, but did not step onto the sterile tiles. Its gaze stayed fixed on the pup, unwavering. Emily leaned in, stethoscope against the frail chest. Her lips pressed into a tight line. Weak heartbeat. Hypothermia. Severe dehydration. We'll need heat packs, fluids, maybe oxygen if he slips again. She glanced up at Daniel. You did the right thing bringing him here. Daniel exhaled slowly, the tension easing from his shoulders at her words. James gave a low whistle. Well, Cole, looks like you passed the test. Dog drags you into a moral mess, and you still come out shining. Daniel shot him a dry look, but even he couldn't fully mask the flicker of relief that crossed his face. His gaze returned to the shepherd, who sat trembling, eyes burning not just with desperation now, but with something else, fragile trust. And in that moment, Daniel knew, no regulation, no reprimand could undo the choice already made. The infirmary was a world apart from the compound outside, sterile and bright, the sharp tang of antiseptic layered over the faint hum of fluorescent lights. The windows were fogged, blurring the dawn beyond. The pup lay on the examination table, wrapped in a towel warmed by heating packs, its ribs shuddering with every shallow breath. Dr. Emily Carter moved briskly, her gloved hand steady as she checked the frail chest with her stethoscope. Years of training showed in the clipped efficiency of her motions, yet her eyes softened whenever they lingered on the pup. At her side, Private Maria Torres worked with quiet urgency, fetching supplies, holding instruments, anticipating needs without being told. Barely 5'3", Torres's small hands moved with surprising strength and precision. She had grown up the eldest of many siblings, and that training, the habit of carrying more than her share, shone through in the way she worked. Daniel stood back, fists clenched at his sides, every nerve in his body strung taut as a wire. He had seen battlefields, had seen medics kneel in desert sand, had seen friends saved and others lost in moments that hung between breaths. Yet this tiny life on the table, felt no less critical. At the doorway, the German shepherd sat rigid, refusing to step onto the sterile tile. His body trembled, his coat still matted with rain, but his amber eyes locked on the pup, unblinking. He did not pace. He did not bark. He simply sat, every muscle braced, as if guarding the fragile creature with the last of his strength. The intensity of his vigil did not go unnoticed. Corporal James Walker leaned against the wall, arms folded, the usual grin tempered by something closer to respect. For once, he kept quiet, his eyes flicking between Daniel and the shepherd with wonder. Outside in the corridor, Marines slowed as they passed, drawn by whispers of the scene. Sergeant Luke Harris, a tall, broad man with a freckled face and a laugh normally heard across the mess hall, peered in and rubbed the back of his neck. "That mutt's not leaving, is he?" he murmured to a younger lance corporal beside him. The reply came hushed, almost reverent. "They're calling him Guardian." The name spread quickly, whispered down the corridor, repeated in the barracks. Guardian. It fit too perfectly to ignore. Inside, Emily adjusted the foredrip, her brow furrowed. "He's on the edge," she muttered, mostly to herself. "It'll depend on how long his body can fight." She caught Daniel's gaze across the table. "You did the right thing." Daniel gave a single nod, jaw tight. His eyes flicked to the shepherd. Guardian's chest rose and fell with ragged rhythm, his gaze fixed unyielding on the tiny life. Daniel thought suddenly of soldiers on patrol, refusing to close their eyes even after 36 hours awake because their brothers depended on them. Hours blurred. Outside, the compound roared back to life, boots striking pavement, sergeants barking cadence, trucks rumbling past. Inside, the world had shrunk to the pup's weak pulse and Guardian's steady watch. Torres fetched gauze and warmed saline, her forehead damp with sweat. Emily hunched over the table, her voice crisp as she ordered instruments, her face set in hard focus. Once, James slipped out and returned with coffee, muttering about nurses running on fumes. No one laughed, but the gesture was not lost. Guardian never moved. At times his body trembled so violently Daniel thought he might collapse, but instead the dog only shifted, pressing his paws together again in that strange, almost holy gesture. A couple of Marines watching through the window gasped softly. One whispered, "That's no ordinary stray." Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Emily leaned back. Her hairline was damp with sweat, her eyes shadowed with fatigue. Then, faint but undeniable, her lips curved into a tired smile. Stable. For now. Daniel let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. James clapped him lightly on the shoulder, his grin returning. "Looks like you've got yourself a guardian angel, Cole." As if on cue, the shepherd's body sagged. He gave one long exhale, then lowered himself onto the floor. His eyes slipped half-closed, his body finally yielding to exhaustion. It wasn't surrender, Daniel realized. It was release. A soldier standing down only when his comrade was safe. The room fell into a reverent quiet. Everyone understood the truth of it, this dog hadn't stumbled onto their base by accident. He had chosen his post, chosen his vigil. And only when the pup breathed steady did he allow himself to rest. Daniel knelt, his calloused hand hovering before it came to rest gently on the shepherd's damp fur. The coat was coarse, tangled, but warm under his palm. "Rest," he whispered. "You've done enough for now." The steady beep of the monitor filled the silence, mingling with the pup's fragile breaths. In the hallway, Marines exchanged glances that carried the weight of something unspoken. A name had been born, and it would stay. Morning broke gray and reluctant over Savannah, the coastal fog clinging stubbornly even as the sun pushed through. The compound stirred with its usual rhythm, reveille echoing, boots striking pavement, rifles clattering in drills. Inside the infirmary, Sergeant Daniel Cole dozed lightly in a chair. His arms were crossed, his mind tethered to the fragile life on the table. The pup still breathed, weak but steady, tucked into blankets and tethered to 4 lines. On the floor by the doorway, curled like a sentinel, lay the German shepherd. Guardian. His ribs lifted and fell in shallow rhythm, his damp fur drying in tufts, his ears flicking even in sleep as though refusing to fully surrender. Daniel rubbed his face, the rasp of stubble scratching against his palm. Then he felt it, a tug at his sleeve. Blinking awake, he looked down. Guardian had risen, stiff but alert, amber eyes burning with new purpose. The dog gave a low whine, pressed his nose firmly against Daniel's arm, then padded toward the door. He stopped, looked back, tail rigid, waiting. "You want me to follow?" Daniel muttered. It wasn't really a question. The corridor outside was filling with Marines on their way to duty, chatter bouncing off concrete walls. Corporal James Walker appeared, balancing a tray of steaming coffee like a card dealer at a casino. His sandy hair was already refusing regulation, sticking up in tufts. Spotting Daniel, he called out, grinning, "Cole. Thought you'd be welded to that pup's bedside. What's this? Taking the big guy for a walk?" Daniel shook his head, pulling his jacket tighter. "Not a walk. He's leading me." James arched a brow, amused. "Well, hell. Maybe he's showing you where he buried his paycheck." But curiosity flickered in his eyes, and he fell into step, juggling cups and muttering curses when hot coffee sloshed onto his hand. Guardian moved with certainty, weaving through the compound toward the main gate. Lance Corporal Henry Miles was on duty now, tall and lanky, ears sticking out like they belonged to a boy rather than a soldier. He squinted as Guardian pawed at the post and barked once, sharp and insistent. "Sir," Henry said, scratching the back of his neck. "The mutt's asking for a field trip." Daniel gave the signal. The gate creaked open. Guardian slipped through at once, nose low to the ground, paws splashing through shallow puddles on the asphalt. They trailed him into a narrow alley that ran along the outer wall. Cracked pavement. Rusting dumpsters. The heavy stink of rot and rainwater. Guardian stopped suddenly, ears pricked forward, body taut. He gave a sharp bark, then pawed at a sagging cardboard box half hidden behind bins. Daniel's pulse quickened. He crouched, pulling the box free. A faint whimper drifted out, so small, so fragile it could have been mistaken for the squeak of rusted hinges. Inside lay two more pups, curled into one another. Their fur was patchy, their ribs sharp under thin skin. One gave a weak kick, the other only shivered, eyes half shut. James bent low, his usual grin gone, replaced by a furrowed brow. "Jesus," he muttered. "There's more." Without thinking, he set his coffee cups on the ground. Guardian pressed his nose against the box, whining urgently. His eyes flicked to Daniel's, commanding without words, "Don't hesitate." Daniel gathered the box into his arms. The frail bodies radiated almost no warmth, breaths shallow, gasping. He could feel their bones even through the cardboard. They were shadows of life, clinging desperately. A voice broke the silence. "Are those?" They turned. A tall, slender woman stood at the alley's edge, her silver hair coiled neatly in a bun. Clara Whitlo. She was in her late 60s, a civilian who worked part-time on base, managing laundry with a quiet dignity. Widowed young, she had raised 2 sons alone, one of whom never came back from deployment. Loss had etched her face with sorrow, but also left her with a fierce compassion that surfaced in moments like this. Clara stepped forward slowly, wringing her hands in the folds of her cardigan. Her gray-blue eyes widened as she glimpsed the pups. "Oh heavens," her voice broke. Daniel straightened, holding the box against his chest. "Found them behind the bins. Guardian led us here." Clara's gaze shifted to the shepherd. Her expression softened, awe flickering across her features. "He knew," she whispered. "Some animals know more than we give them credit for." She reached out a trembling hand toward the box, then stopped herself, afraid to harm the fragile creatures. "Please, Sergeant, get them warm." Daniel nodded firmly. "We will." Guardian pressed close, his steps quick despite exhaustion, eyes fixed on the box as though willing the pups inside to keep breathing. By the time they reached the infirmary again, the whispers had already spread through the compound. More pups. Guardian found them. Led his handler straight to them. Inside, Emily Carter looked up from the recovering pup on the table. Her face hardened as she spotted the box. "Not again," she breathed, but her hands were already reaching for fresh blankets. Torres moved swiftly, clearing space on the counter. Daniel lowered the box gently. The 2 pups whimpered faintly as Torres lifted them one by one with delicate care. Emily's voice snapped sharp orders: "Heat packs. Glucose solution. Fluids, immediately." James leaned against the wall, his usual jokes forgotten. "They keep coming, Cole," he murmured. His eyes shifted to Guardian, who had collapsed into a sit near the counter, gaze fixed unyielding on the fragile lives above. "And that dog, he's not stopping until every last one is found." Daniel placed a steadying hand on Guardian's back, feeling the thin ribs beneath matted fur. "Then neither will we," he said quietly. In that moment, with fog still clinging outside and the soft cries of rescued pups filling the room, the line between regulation and compassion blurred until it disappeared entirely. By late morning, the fog lifted, unveiling Savannah in muted gold. The compound shook itself awake, squads drilling in cadence on the parade ground, engines revving in the motor pool, sergeants shouting over the thud of boots. Yet beneath the routine, something else stirred. Word of the German shepherd had spread like fire through dry brush. By noon, the story had reached every barracks. A starving stray had walked through the gate, pressed its paws together like a prayer, and delivered life into the Marine's hands. Men repeated the tale with variations. Some swore they saw tears in the dog's eyes. Others claimed he bowed like a man. But the core truth didn't change. The shepherd had begged for help, and the Marines had answered. In the infirmary, the transformation was quiet but steady. Private First Class Tommy Green, a 19-year-old recruit from Kentucky, was the first to slip inside, red-haired and freckled, clutching a folded blanket. He muttered something about drill practice as he laid it gently at the foot of the kennel before scurrying out. Later, Sergeant Luke Harris, broad, freckled, his usual booming laugh hushed, arrived with a dented thermos of warm milk. "Figured it might help more than ration issue stuff," he said, pretending to grumble as he set it down. Others followed. A pair of corporals smuggled in towels from the laundry. Private Jameson Lee, a wiry young cook with quick hands, sneaked in scraps of boiled chicken, muttering that he was testing recipes. The infirmary, once sterile and impersonal, began to resemble a patchwork shelter. Blankets lined the kennels. Towels were stacked in corners. The faint smell of antiseptic mixed with the richer sense of milk and food. And in the center of it all, Guardian lay sprawled near the cages, rising whenever a pup stirred, his amber eyes softening as he checked each one. But not every Marine welcomed the change. In the mess hall, over trays of scrambled eggs and lukewarm coffee, Corporal David Riker's voice rose above the chatter. Riker was in his early 30s, dark-haired, his perpetual scowl making him look older. "We're Marines, not an animal shelter," he said, stabbing his fork into his plate. "Command hears about this, they won't pat us on the back. They'll shut it down. You think we're heroes for babysitting strays? We're wasting time." A few nodded uneasily. Others kept their heads down, unwilling to pick a side. James Walker, seated at the next table, leaned over with a grin sharp as a knife. "Funny thing, Riker. If it were a Marine dragged and bleeding, you'd be first with bandages. Maybe try seeing loyalty for what it is, no matter the shape it takes." Laughter rippled down the line, dulling the edge of Riker's words. He muttered into his tray but let the subject drop. Daniel stayed out of the mess hall debates. He had little taste for arguments. He chose action. That afternoon, when the supply officer refused to requisition extra food for the dogs, Daniel didn't press. Instead, he walked into town and returned with cans of formula, packets of medicine, and a bag of kibble, all bought from his own paycheck. James caught him unpacking supplies in his office. "You're really going to spend your salary on them, aren't you?" he asked, leaning against the doorframe. Daniel stacked the cans neatly, his voice low but firm. "On the battlefield, we don't leave brothers behind. Out here's no different. They were left behind. That dog refused to. Now neither will I." James let out a long whistle, shaking his head. "You're a stubborn bastard, Cole. Remind me never to get on your bad side. If this is how you treat strays, I can't imagine what you'd do for friends." That night, Guardian stood his silent watch. He paced between kennels, then curled close, pressing his head against the bars, eyes flicking between the small bodies inside. When strangers approached too quickly, a low rumble stirred in his chest until Daniel's hand calmed him. The gaunt shepherd was still starved and rough, but in his vigil he became something larger, a sentinel. The quiet compassion that spread across the compound did not go unnoticed. On the third day, Captain Leonard Briggs stormed into the infirmary. Briggs was a logistics officer in his mid-40s, thick-set, his ruddy face perpetually creased in disapproval. Known for his precision, he was the sort of man who counted crates twice and demanded signatures for staples. To Briggs, order was survival, and exceptions were dangers. He stopped in the doorway, eyes sweeping over the blankets, food bowls, and kennels. His voice cracked like gunfire. "What is this circus? This is a medical facility, not a kennel. Emily Carter folded her arms, meeting his glare steadily. They were brought to our gate in need. We acted. That's what medics do. You've overstepped, Briggs snapped. Regulations are clear. Strays are to be turned over to civilian shelters within 72 hours. You are wasting resources on animals that don't belong here. Guardian rose at once, body stiff, ears pinned back. His growl was low, thunder rumbling through the tile floor. Briggs faltered, though he masked it quickly. His eyes flicked to Daniel. Sergeant. Explain yourself. Daniel stepped forward, his voice level, but firm. Sir. With respect. If we'd abandoned them, they'd be dead already. That's not the kind of Marines we are. Briggs's face darkened. Compassion doesn't excuse disobedience. You're walking a fine line. I'll be filing a report. Command will not be pleased. He turned sharply, boots striking the floor like hammer blows as he left. The silence he left behind was heavy. James exhaled and forced a grin. Well, he muttered, at least he didn't confiscate the milk. No one laughed. Daniel lowered a hand to Guardian's head. The dog's eyes still blazed, body tense as a drawn bowstring. Easy, boy, Daniel murmured. His own chest was tight, the truth weighing heavy. They weren't just sheltering pups anymore. They had stepped into a fight. The infirmary had settled into a fragile rhythm by the week's end. Emily Carter moved briskly through her rounds, sleeves rolled past her elbows, stethoscope slung at her neck. Torres cleaned quietly, humming under her breath, her soft tunes drowned beneath the tick of 4 drips. Daniel came whenever duty allowed, standing by the kennels as though the pups belonged to him now. Guardian never strayed far. He lay stretched across the threshold, ribs rising and falling, his amber eyes unblinking on the tiny lives behind the bars. The Marines had stopped questioning it. Guardian was simply there, the way a guard post or flagpole was there, steady, undeniable. But the uneasy calm cracked one brittle morning. A black sedan rolled through the gates, its windows tinted, its tires humming low. No ceremony. Just silence that pressed on every soldier who caught sight of it. From it stepped Major Richard Vaughn. Vaughn was in his early 50s, tall and angular, his iron-gray hair combed back like steel. His uniform was crisp enough to catch the morning light, the silver oak leaves on his collar gleaming. His face was pale, lips thin, his eyes sharp with a severity that felt less like judgment and more like creed. Vaughn believed in regulations with the zeal of faith. To him, order was survival, and compassion, unchecked, was chaos. At his side marched Captain Briggs, satisfaction curling faintly at the corners of his mouth. Inside the infirmary, Daniel was helping Torres adjust a kennel when the door opened. Vaughn stepped in first, boots sharp against tile. Briggs followed, arms folded. Guardian rose at once. His ears shot forward, body rigid. A growl rippled through his chest, not loud, but deep, steady, the kind of warning that made men pause without knowing why. Vaughn stopped short, his eyes falling on the shepherd. Then they swept the room, catching blankets, food bowls, and the row of kennels. What is this? His tone was not a question. It was an accusation. Daniel straightened, shoulders squared. Sir. Strays found at the gate. They were on the brink. We've been stabilizing them. Vaughn's gaze cut to Briggs. Briggs nodded stiffly, arms locked tight. As I said, Major. Regulations don't permit this. They should have been transferred within 72 hours. Behind Guardian, the pups whimpered softly, as if sensing the tension. The shepherd lowered his stance, growl deepening, his frame coiled between authority and the lives he guarded. The hallway outside had gone silent. Marines lingered at the glass, watching, their conversations hushed. Vaughn stepped forward, his hands clasped behind his back. You've overstepped, Sergeant Cole. Compassion is not an excuse for disobedience. These are not Marines. Not assets of this government. They do not belong here. Emily Carter's voice cut across his words, tight but steady. With respect, sir, if they had been men, no one would question why we kept them alive. Life is life. Vaughn turned on her, his gaze cold as winter steel. Doctor. Your skills are valuable, but they are to be used within the bounds of regulation. This is not a civilian shelter. The silence sharpened. Then Daniel moved. He stepped forward until he stood shoulder to shoulder with Guardian. His boots planted, his jaw set. Sir, he said, voice steady but hard as stone. If you want to take them, you'll have to go through us. The words hit like gunfire. Guardian's growl grew louder, vibrating through the tile. His amber eyes blazed, body taut as if he understood every syllable. Marines outside exchanged glances, some wide-eyed, others smirking faintly with admiration. From the corner, James Walker let out a low whistle. Hell, he muttered. Cole just threw down the gauntlet. Vaughn's lips pressed thin, his jaw tightening. For a long, suffocating moment, no one moved. The pups whimpered again, their tiny cries threading through the silence like fragile protests. Even Briggs shifted uneasily, the smugness faltering from his face. Finally, Vaughn stepped back. His voice cut like glass. You've made your position clear, Sergeant. Now let me make mine. He turned sharply, coat flaring. You have 1 week. By then, these animals will be transferred to proper facilities. If not, disciplinary measures will follow. He strode out, Briggs close behind, their boots echoing down the corridor like hammer strikes. The tension lingered long after the door slammed. Guardian's growl tapered into silence, though his chest still heaved with restrained fire. Daniel reached down, laying a hand on the shepherd's back. Easy, boy, he murmured, though his own voice carried the tremor of adrenaline. Emily exhaled shakily, her shoulders dropping at last. That could have gone worse, she whispered. James snorted from the corner. Or better, depending on how you measure it. You just stared down a major with a dog at your side, Cole. That one'll get retold for years. Daniel didn't reply. His gaze lingered on the kennels, where the pups huddled close together, trembling, unaware of the storm that had just brushed their fragile sanctuary. Guardian lowered himself again, laying his body across the doorway like a wall. His amber eyes smoldered with a vow no order could shake. Daniel crouched beside him, hand resting against the coarse fur. His whisper was low, meant only for the shepherd. We'll find a way. They won't take you. And in that quiet vow, sealed between soldier and stray, the true battle began. The week after Major Vaughn's inspection unfolded beneath a shadow. Every man on base knew the order, within days the pups were to be transferred, their fate swallowed by bureaucracy. The infirmary felt less like a place of healing and more like a fortress under siege. Guardian never moved far from the kennels. He stretched his body across the threshold as though his weight alone could bar the door. His ribs still showed, his coat still rough, but his presence carried the solidity of stone. Daniel carried on with his duties, but his jaw grew tighter each day, his eyes lingering on the pups as if afraid they'd vanish while he turned away. Even James fell quieter, his jokes dulled by the ticking clock. Then something unexpected happened. It began with a photograph. Clara Whitlo, the silver-haired laundress, passed the gate one chilly afternoon. Through the bars she saw Guardian sitting tall in the pale light, his amber eyes fixed unwaveringly on the kennels inside. The dog was gaunt, weather-beaten, but resolute. His figure framed against the order of the base seemed carved out of loyalty itself. Clara's hands trembled as she lifted her old point-and-shoot camera. The shutter clicked. That evening, her nephew, a college student with a habit of posting online, shared the picture with a simple caption, "Even soldiers need guardians." By morning, the photo had raced across Savannah. By evening, it had traveled further still. And then came Ethan. Ethan Miller was 10 years old, thin as a reed, cheeks flushed red by cold. He lived with his mother on the outskirts of the city, their small home warmed more by her grit than by the heater. Ethan had always loved dogs, though his family could never afford one. When he overheard neighbors speaking about the marine dog and his pups, something stirred in him. The next morning, he pulled on a coat too thin for the frost, clutched 2 crumpled dollar bills in his small fist, and walked the long road to the gate. His scuffed boots slapped the pavement with stubborn purpose. Lance Corporal Henry Miles spotted him first. The lanky guard tilted his head, ears sticking out comically. "Hey, kid," he called, trying for lightness. "This ain't exactly a playground." Ethan stopped, panting from the walk, and held out his 2 bills. I came to help the dogs," he said. His voice was small but steady. "It isn't much, but maybe it can buy them food." Henry's grin faltered. For a moment he just stared, throat tight. Then he ducked inside and returned with Sergeant Cole. Daniel crouched to meet Ethan at eye level, the broad-shouldered Marine suddenly softened. "What's your name, son?" "Ethan," the boy whispered. Daniel took the 2 bills gently, folding them in his calloused hand as though they were worth a fortune. "Ethan," he said, his voice thick. "This means more than you know. Guardian and the pups thank you." Behind the gate, Guardian rose. His ears pricked forward, his amber eyes fixing on the boy. Ethan's breath caught, awe flooding his face. For a heartbeat, soldier, child, and stray were bound together by a thread stronger than rules. Word of Ethan's gift spread like wildfire. That evening, packages began arriving at the gate. An elderly couple dropped off an old quilt, faded but warm. A young mother left cans of dog food in a stroller basket. Children scribbled letters in crayon, dogs with halos, Marines saluting, shaky words like, "Stay strong," and, "Don't let him be sad." Even the skeptics softened. In the mess hall, where Riker once barked about Marines not running a shelter, his voice grew quiet. He kept his eyes on his tray while Guardian's photo appeared again and again on screens around him. Soon local newspapers carried the story, Clara's photograph stamped across the front page with the headline, "The Guardian at the Gate." Television crews gathered at the fence, cameras catching glimpses of the shepherd sitting tall, Marines passing quietly behind him, townsfolk taping notes to the bars. Inside the infirmary, Emily Carter read one of the letters aloud. Her professional tone faltered as she spoke the words written in a child's hand, "Dear Marines, please don't let the dog be sad. He is brave. I believe in him." Torres turned away, wiping her eyes quickly. No one mentioned it. By the weekend, the command office was swamped with calls. Not from generals, but from civilians. Their voices rose in defense of the shepherd and his pups. Vaughn's order still existed on paper, but its weight bent under the gaze of the public. The announcement came quietly one morning, transfer postponed. Pending review. Official words, but everyone knew the truth. The voices beyond the gate had grown too loud to ignore. Daniel read the memo with a long, slow exhale. Relief broke across his stern face. For the first time since that foggy morning, he looked at Guardian and saw something different. The shepherd's amber eyes, still rimmed with hardship, softened. His body eased, his head lowering slightly. For a fleeting moment, he allowed himself to trust. Winter in Savannah softened as the weeks passed. The air lost its bite, the fog lifted earlier each morning, and the compound shifted back toward its usual rhythm. But inside the infirmary, life had changed for good. The pups grew stronger. The first, the one Guardian had carried in that rain-soaked sack, no longer whimpered at every breath. His ribs filled out, his eyes grew clearer, and he stumbled across the floor with clumsy paws that tripped over each other. The other two, once skeletal, now tugged playfully at Torres's shoelaces, burning laughter that even drills outside could not drown. Emily Carter, though never one to bend rules lightly, found herself lingering longer at the kennels. She jotted notes about their recovery with the same precision she used for patients, her stethoscope resting as comfortably on the pups as on Marine's. Torres hummed while she fed them, her soft melodies now bright and full. The compound itself leaned into the change. Marine stopped by between duties, slipping bits of chicken or tossing balls made of knotted socks. Luke Harris boomed with laughter when a pup toppled over trying to bark. Henry Miles, usually awkward, sat cross-legged on the floor, letting one curl into his lap until his freckled face softened into something almost paternal. And always, Guardian watched. He never strayed far, pacing between the kennels, lying near the threshold, his amber eyes sharp but calmer now. He no longer trembled with hunger, thanks to the food that arrived daily from townsfolk. His coat, once ragged, began to shine faintly. But his loyalty never shifted. Every night, he lay across the doorway, as if promising the world that nothing would touch those pups without going through him first. The tide of support beyond the gates did not fade. Children pressed crayon drawings against the fence. Families dropped off toys, food, even blankets stitched with the words for Guardian. The shepherd's photograph hung in shop windows, his name whispered in church pews, repeated at dinner tables. Even Major Vaughn could not ignore it. He returned to the compound weeks later, his expression as rigid as ever, but his orders tempered. No immediate transfer. No dismantling of the kennels. Only silence, as though the weight of public gaze had pressed down even on him. The adoptions began quietly. A childless couple took one of the pups, their eyes wet as the tiny shepherd nestled into their arms. A young Marine's parents adopted another, their farm in the Carolinas ready for the lively bark that filled their pickup truck. Each departure was bittersweet. Torres wiped her eyes in secret, Emily busied herself with charts, and James Walker made poor jokes about doggy boot camp to hide the tightness in his throat. But the joy outweighed the sorrow. The pups had found homes, safe and warm. Only one remained. The first pup. The one Guardian had carried in the sack. He was stronger now, bounding clumsily on oversized paws, nipping playfully at Daniel's boots whenever the sergeant passed. His eyes were bright, his bark sharp and proud. Yet Guardian still hovered, nose pressed to the pup's fur, as though reluctant to let go. One evening, Daniel crouched beside Guardian at the threshold. The compound beyond was bathed in sunset, the air tinged orange and gold. He placed a hand on the shepherd's coarse fur, his voice low. "You've done your duty. You saved them. The others have homes now. But this one," his eyes shifted to the pup tumbling after his own shadow. "This one's yours. And mine." Guardian's amber gaze lifted, steady and searching. Then, slowly, the shepherd leaned against Daniel's side. It wasn't dramatic. No bark, no whine. Just the quiet weight of trust, finally surrendered. James leaned against the doorway, watching with a rare softness in his eyes. "Well, Cole," he said, voice gentle, "looks like you've been adopted." Emily smiled faintly, Torres laughed through her tears, and even the Marines gathered outside exchanged quiet nods. It wasn't regulation. It wasn't planned. But it was right. From that night on, Guardian was no longer the stray at the gate. He became part of the unit, part of the story etched into the compound's walls. A dog who had once been bones and hunger now stood tall beside a Marine, his place earned not by command but by loyalty. Years later, men would still tell the tale, of the German shepherd who pressed his paws together like a prayer, who carried a pup in his jaws through the rain, who defied authority with silent strength. They would tell of the boy who gave $2 crumpled, the town that rallied, and the Marine who chose compassion over regulation. And they would always end with the same words, spoken with respect that needed no embellishment. He was called Guardian.